But first of all, I'm going to start with two quotations involving three prime ministers. I need a prop, and I might ask Dr. Mordini to be my sort of prop. So, Dr. Mordini, I'm going to ask you to be Tony Abbott, but don't worry, don't have to say anything, right? And picture us all being in the House of Representatives chamber. You've all seen it on television, and there's a dispatch box between you and I'm looking at you, and you're the opposition leader. And I say this to you, and this is the first quotation. If he wants to know what misogyny looks like in modern Australia, he doesn't need a motion in the House of Representatives. No, he doesn't need a motion. He needs a mirror. That's what he needs. That's the end of your part. And many of you would have realised that that was from the famous speech by our former Prime Minister, Julia Gillard. Another quotation was not said in the House of Representatives. It was said on a private phone call. And it went something like this. Julia, I am the Prime Minister. That was Scott Morrison to me in a phone call. It was sort of kind of weird. It was just after the leadership coup, as if I'd missed the news cycle, you know, I knew who he was. It was an unnecessary assertion of his power, as I had been serving as a government MP at that time. But what I loved a lot about Julia Gillard's misogyny speech, as we all did. It's its 10th year anniversary this year. I loved the words, he needs a mirror. Because when all of us look in the mirror, what's looking back at us is what only we know. And obviously those close to us maybe. But we know our truth. We know our values. We know our integrity, and we know our intuition. We know all of those things because they're internal to us. And as we get older, all those things become more honed. But those four things make up something that I'm going to talk about today, a type of power that is far greater than positional power, and that is personal power. One of those things, intuition, it's often attributed to women, you know, women's intuition. But I believe we all have it. We all have it from childhood. For example, when I was a little girl, 6 years old, in primary school, and this boy turned around in the playground and he said, "Wog, go back to your home country." I didn't know the meaning of the word. I ran home after school that day, and the first thing I did was take down my brother's dictionary from the bookshelf and look it up. And it said, a man from a foreign land who is living somewhere other than his home country. I'm of Greek heritage, but I'm born here. My mother was born here. My father came out here when he was a teenager from Greece. And I thought, I don't know anywhere else, but Australia is my home. But you know, I didn't need the definition because I knew intuitively from his tone. I knew from his tone that it was nasty, that it made me feel excluded, unsafe, fearful. I knew that. A few years later, and a little bit older, a teenager, this wasn't intuition. I knew for a fact that I did not want to go to my brother's speech night, even though it was Melbourne High School. He's an old boy, right? I knew that. And, you know, that was but Mum insisted I go, right? And that was back in the day when I didn't have one of these things to distract me, you know, that sort of very common manoeuvre that we all know and love. But I wouldn't have needed a mobile phone because I believe I would have had the same reaction at that speech night when I heard some 1,000 boys create this magnificent sound in Melbourne Town Hall. I had never seen anything like it. I'd never been to a big live performance or anything like that, and just this magnificence of the sound and the moment just really struck me. And as I was in the car, in the back of the car, my brother was clutching his prize. I was looking at the boards out there. I can't remember what it was, but anyway. And he was clutching his prize, and I was thinking about the words of the song. And the song the boys were singing was our national anthem, but before it became our national anthem. And I remember thinking at that time, as a young girl, Pity the words were, Australian sons let us rejoice. Oh, it must have been because it's a boys' school. That must be why. I was so moved by that event that some 40 years later, when I made my first speech, my maiden speech to the Parliament of Australia, when I was elected in 2016, that I mention it. And I mention it because I was grateful that in the referendum that was put to the Australian people, the words were changed to Australians all let us rejoice. And most recently, they were changed from for we are young and free to for we are one and free. I was grateful for that. And I realised also with the effluxion of time that what I loved about that moment really was that sense of inclusion, that my brother could be part of something so magnificent. That was all intuitive. But as we grow older, as we stop being adults in waiting, you know, when we hit 16, 17, 18, those four things, your truth, your values, your intuition, it all becomes much more honed because you have to make decisions, be it subject selection, your career pathways, all sorts of decisions, life decisions. You'll make good decisions, bad decisions. And I refuse to believe that intuition is something that's spontaneous, that you just think of. It is actually part of the reasoning process because you might consult with people. You are maturing and taking into account all sorts of possibilities when you're intuitive about something. And quite often, you got to throw a bit of courage in when you've got a decision where you're weighing up two options, for example. That old expression of trust your gut, that's saying trust your instinct. And it's such an important thing as we carry on in our own life's journey. One of the hardest decisions I've ever had to make was at the same time of that conversation when Scott Morrison emphasised to me that he was the Prime Minister, emphasised his positional power. That was day one of 3 months, which I'm about to describe. It was just after the leadership coup where he and Peter Dutton were both king ringleaders in a coup which ousted Malcolm Turnbull from the leadership, under whose prime ministership I had served. And I decided, I knew intuitively, that I did not want to continue to serve after the next election under Scott Morrison, but I was going to, take it quietly, but nonetheless, I wanted to be honest and I wanted to issue a statement to say I wouldn't be recontesting the next election. So I was planning to sit in the backbench until the next election. Morrison didn't want me to do this. I got a message to him just literally days after he was sworn in. I was trying to reach him. I was told it was part of the delaying tactics so that he didn't return my call. He always had in the past. But nonetheless, I got the message to him through his ministers, and finally he rang and he said, "You can't do this now." And I said, "Scott, I have to. I can't lie to my family, my friends, my constituents for the remainder of this time. But don't worry, I'll be polite about it. I'm just going to issue a statement on social media." No, you have to wait 2 months. No, Scott, I'm driving to my office with wine and chocolates for my staff. I have to make this statement now. And he said, "Wait a month." No. And then he said, "I am the Prime Minister." And then finally he said, "Give me 24 hours. And I thought, okay, I'll give him 24 hours. He probably has to create a 2-line statement. That was my first mistake. I woke up the next morning at about the 20-hour mark and the story was breaking. I'd only told my closest family, friends and staff at this stage. It was breaking. So I issued the statement and then Morrison rang me again and he said, "Do me another favour, don't speak to the media." Okay, it was the last thing I felt like doing. My phone was going nuts, television in the background. Okay. That was my second mistake. Because later that day, as I said, it was big political news that day, not about me, but big political news going on. And a Prime Minister always does what is known as a doorstop presser. And finally, at the end of the press conference, at the end of that, someone said, "What do you think about Julia Banks not recontesting the next election?" And I was watching him And I was confused. I was just looking at the television thinking, why is he saying that? Why is he saying that like that? And he said this. He said, what am I doing right now? I'm reaching out to Julia and speaking to Julia and checking in with Julia and making sure Julia gets all the support she needs in what has been a torrid ordeal for her. And believe me, he emphasises her. You can look at the footage on 7:30 report. I was really confused. And meanwhile, I'm doing my thing of not speaking to the media, even though my phone's going nuts. But I've have built very good friendships with respected journalists and MPs, some of whom were ringing me out of concern, not for a comment. And I found out that the Prime Minister's office had used that 24 hours to background against me. Now, backgrounding, for those of you who don't know, backgrounding is an ethical journalist's tool. For example, if you were going to write an article about something medical, you might consult a medical expert and not attribute it to them, but get the background on them. But I found out they were backgrounding that I'd had a nervous breakdown. Don't speak to her. She's emotional, hysterical. So I was this weak petal who hadn't coped with the leadership coup. Nonetheless, I thought, oh, we'll press on. I thought, this is an esteemed public platform. I wanted to continue to advocate for things that were important to me, such as climate change action. I made a speech to get the kids off Nauru for refugees. I made a speech about quotas and gender equal representation. But the more I spoke, the more the highest powers in the land took me through what I call the sexist spectrum. And the way they do it is backgrounding. Certain journalists get weaponised in the Murdoch press, and suddenly it appears, and then it's this whole cycle of vile social media. So I went through the sexist spectrum from being the weak petal to the troublemaker, to the liar, to the bully bitch. It was just extraordinary. I felt powerless. I felt I had no control over all of this. The highest powers in the land were doing everything they could to discredit my mental health and destroy my professional reputation. In the meantime, I had a few other phone calls from Scott Morrison, including one and other ministers who said, we can take you away from all this. And I was implied an offer of a ministerial appointment or we'll offer you the United Nations delegate position. Will take me out of the parliament and out of the country, but still retain my vote. Or this one, he said, I'll speak to Bill, as in Shorten, the opposition leader, to get you a pair. Now, a pair would have meant leave, potentially, and no doubt it was probably going to be characterised as unlimited, as mental health leave. When he offered me that, I simply said, I'm not sick. I'll see you in Parliament. Nonetheless, that 3 months was the most distressing, gut-wrenching period of my entire career. And I have worked in courtrooms and boardrooms, but never had I experienced anything like that. So I felt my truth and my values hadn't changed. But I believed that if I were to exit this place, and no one knew when the election was going to be called, it was important to me that it was recorded in Hansard that I came in as an independent person and I would join the crossbench as an independent MP. So I made the speech on November 29, I think it was, at 12 noon precisely, and I became an independent MP. After I made that speech, Nikki Gemmell, the media went nuts. It was just all over the press. And I'm told it was the only time in Australian political history that a backbencher had appeared on the front page of every single newspaper in the country, including a photograph of me where I look very alone. I look fearful. And the men are walking out. It was on the front page. It was quite a famous photograph. And that is how I felt, because I knew they would go for me. But nonetheless, inside of me, I was resolute and strong. I thought, I'm speaking my truth, right? So I'm going to continue to do this. I'm going to continue the rest of my term to continue to advocate for all those things that are important to me and important for the benefit of others. At one stage during the voting period, when you see the MPs walking around the House deciding on their vote, and this was a vote related to the refugees, related to legislation that we were trying to pass to provide medical assistance to a very ill refugees, the Medivac legislation. And an MP walked past me and said, "So how does it feel to be the most powerful woman in the country, or powerful person in the country?" And I looked at him when he said that to me as I was walking to make my vote, because this vote depended on one vote, and it was my vote, right? And I looked at him and I thought, no, the most powerful person in the country is sitting right over there, the Prime Minister with the government. They're the most powerful people, right? But nonetheless, I had my personal power. I wasn't mesmerised by that or, affected by that at all. The journalist and well-known author, Nikki Gemmell, tweeted something along the lines of referring to my speech as audacious and courageous. And she said, "Julia Banks will go down in history as the woman who spoke truth to power. The haters will go for her. I wish her well." The haters did go for me, but what came towards me was people from across Australia who supported me, not just for me, but shared their stories with me. Many supported me as an independent. So I tell that story because it is so important to always think, no matter if you cop racism or ageism, or as in my case, sexism. I copped all three during that 3-month period, I've got to say, be it on social media or in the press. No matter if you're the Prime Minister or a backbencher or a staffer, no matter if you're a CEO or the General Manager or a junior graduate employee, no matter if you're the sports captain or sitting on the bench, no matter your position, your personal power and your intuition is the greatest and the most powerful power of all. Thank you so much.